Okay, so I have 12 o'clock here in Halifax. My name is Maggie McMichael. I'm the governance team support for the governance team of the RPLC, the Rural Policy Webinar, from the very class Halifax, Nova Scotia. Rob, things, you will notice that your microphone has been muted, and that will remain muted throughout the webinar. So if you have any questions, they can be sent through the chat box, which should appear at the bottom of your screen. And I will be monitoring the questions. If you do have a clarification question during the presentation, please share that as it comes up, and John, who's on site with Rob, will help you out there. All other questions can be left to the end, and I will read through in the order that they come. If you do have a kind of a complex question or want to respond to Rob, you can send a note through the chat box and we can unmute you for a short period. And we do have Michael Blatherwick of the RPLC who's on as the logistical and technical support person. So he'll be in charge of muting and unmuting microphones. The presentation will be about 40 minutes in length, and then there'll be about half an hour for questions afterwards. And you will note that the webinar is being recorded, so once the video is processed, it will be posted to the RPLC YouTube site, and we can share that link with you as well. And I've also been asked to ask you if you can use your full name. I think when signing in, I think there's an option, and for that, just so that we know who it was that attended versus who signed up for the webinar. So without further ado, I'll introduce Rob Greenwood.
I'll just interrupt one sec, Maggie. So sure. I have two small points. One is this is a web-based program, so if your internet connection is a little choppy, I noticed Maggie, yours chopped up a little bit, and
okay.
So don't be afraid. And sometimes if your internet connection boots you out, just try to log back in, or sometimes it'll boot automatically. So that's the funness that we have with technology. And there was one other point I had. I should have wrote it down. That's okay. Like Maggie mentioned, if you have any questions, I know. If you need your microphone unmuted, please you can send a private message to the RPLC Central. That is the account that I use for managing the microphone. So if you want your microphone unmuted, just send a private message to RPLC Central. Okay, that's it. Or ask Maggie, and Maggie will tell me. That works too.
Great, thanks, Michael. So Rob is the Executive Director of Public Engagement for Memorial University of Newfoundland, Canada, and of the Leslie Harris Centre of Regional Policy and Development. He is lead on the public engagement framework for the university, which coordinates and supports the university's collaboration with partners and stakeholders. Rob has operated his own consulting business and has served as Director and Assistant Deputy Minister of Policy and Economic Development Departments in Newfoundland and Labrador and in Saskatchewan. Rob holds a PhD in Industrial and Business Studies from the University of Warwick, England, which he attended as a Commonwealth Scholar and an Institute of Social and Economic Research Doctoral Fellow. He was Newfoundland's representative on the International Advisory Board of the North Atlantic Islands Program and co-edited Competing Strategy of Socioeconomic Development for Small Islands. He was also co-editor of Remote Control, Lessons in Governance for and from Small, Insular, and Remote Regions. He has taught, consulted, published, and presented extensively on community economic and regional development, strategic economic planning, sectoral and cluster development, and knowledge mobilization. So I'll hand it over to you, Rob. Thank you so much for coming to be here today and share your lessons learned.
Rob, I don't have any audio coming through for you. Oh, it must be because you're using a Mac. No, I'm just kidding. I have a Mac. And that was odd because we did the microphone test earlier. Your microphone and video are live. So when you keep on testing it and
Aha.
there we go. There we go.
Rob
put the microphone on himself.
Oh, John, I told you not to let him do that.
Self-serve can never work.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Let me get the presentation back up here.
Okay, I think we're in business.
There we go. Good stuff.
And I'll assume you can hear me and see me okay?
Yep, sounds good.
All right, great. Well, thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be presenting here in St. John's, Newfoundland, and over the web in a fantastic selection of folks from across the country and internationally, and lots of colleagues from across the North Atlantic Forum and the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, RPLC, and numerous other networks. So really delighted to be sharing what I was asked to present on, which was the product of the book that came out of a North Atlantic Forum surf conference in Twillingate several years ago, and I'll talk more about that. But I'll also weave in material and ideas and thoughts from what is getting to be numerous decades of my work researching, but also working in regional development, community development, sector development, etc. So I'm going to dive right into it. I want to get through the presentation in about 40 minutes. And I think if anybody has any key clarification questions along the way, you can let the moderator know, and I'm happy to respond. But I think in terms of discussion, Q&A, we're better to wait till the end. And so I will endeavor to get through the slides quickly, and we can always come back to a particular slide if you want. So a lot of this work is really a lovely collaboration that goes back to the early 1990s now, and even beyond, when I think my first surf conference might have been 1989, and Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation. The Island Studies, Institute of Island Studies at UPEI. Harry Baglow was the director at the time and still quite active. I'm delighted to continue to work with Harry and Laurie Brinklow and the team at UPEI to see the network across the North Atlantic Rim as well. And so we had the North Atlantic Islands program that Harry and Barry Bartman, passed away this past year, were really the leaders on. And that involved Newfoundland and Labrador, Prince Edward Island, Iceland, the Isle of Man, Åland Islands, I'll talk more about. And I don't know if I missed, the Faroe Islands. And it might have mentioned Greenland. And I have a map coming up where I'll talk more about that. And the North Atlantic Forum continues as a superb network that grew out of the North Atlantic Islands program and has a meeting conference every 2 years. The next one is coming up in Boo, Norway. Sheila Downer, my colleague with the Office of Public Engagement at Memorial, based in the Labrador Straits in Labrador, is Memorial's representative on the University of the Arctic these days, along with some other colleagues. But also the Office of Public Engagement is offering to serve the North Atlantic Forum as an ongoing secretariat. So we're quite active in feeding into the upcoming conference. And the last one in Charlottetown, in Summerside, in PEI, was again a partnership of SURF and the North Atlantic Forum. So the collaboration continues. And my main day job, in addition to public engagement at Memorial, it continues to be the Harris Center. And we're one of the partners in the RPLC project. Boyan First, our manager of knowledge mobilization, is our lead in that and is in the room here with me, keeping track so that when I screw up, he can correct me. In terms of the North Atlantic Forum and the book that came out of it from Twillingate, Remote Control, co-edited by my longtime colleague. We shared an office at Warwick University when we did our PhDs together. And Larry Felt, who edited ICER books for many years, longtime collaborator on the North Atlantic Islands program, co-edited the book on fisheries that came out of that project. So we took the product of the conference in Twillingate and produced the book that came out of that, Remote Control Governance Lessons for and from Small, Insular, and Remote Regions. So there are people like Godfrey and others who focus on islands specifically. Of course, there are islands that are more metaphorical or less, we always debate whether Cape Breton with a causeway. The people in Cape Breton are very adamant that it is indeed an island, and they hosted one of the North Atlantic forums. But remote regions also, and rural remote, remote northern, have many of the same challenges and opportunities as some islands. So it was great when SURF and the North Atlantic Forum came together. I think it was for the first time in Twillingate, but then there was a subsequent conference in St. John's. And in fact, a book that came out of that conference, co-edited by Kelly Vodden, Ryan Gibson, and the omnipresent Godfrey Baldacchino, called Place Peripheral, Place-Based Development in Rural, Island, and Remote Regions. So it's an ongoing area of scholarship, but very much engaged scholarship. So working with communities, industry, non-government organizations, governments, everybody has expertise. Coming together, we all learn, and we have a much better chance of applying the key lessons we learned. So happy to come back to that if anybody wants to discuss that stuff. So the North Atlantic Rim for Newfoundland and Labrador is really where we live. Memorial has a new initiative under our Office of Public Engagement that cuts across the whole university called Coasts, and it's cold oceans and Arctic, science, technology, and society. We just spent a week in Ottawa, attended the Northern Lights Conference. I'll probably mention that again later in the presentation. And so we're very active in not the high Arctic, but certainly as Nunavut, see a lot more marine transportation, a more active commercial fishery, and very active self-governance. Memorial is quite active in those partnerships. But historically, of course, I don't know if we brag about it, but we were Britain's first colony. And well before that, of course, the Vikings were here in Lansom Meadows, the only clearly established. I know Harry Bagwell is quite convinced they were in PEI, and I'm sure they were. But you go to Lansom Meadows, you can see all the relics and the huts, and the sagas support all that. And even Red Bay, Labrador, before Columbus ever so-called discovered the New World. Red Bay, Labrador was the oil capital of the world with whale oil. So the lamps of Europe were lit with whale oil from Red Bay and the Basque whalers. There's lots of amazing sites there. So that North Atlantic Rim transportation and cultural connection has been there many, many, many years. And so that continues to infuse our work in the North Atlantic Forum, in the Harris Center at Memorial. But when you look beyond that, worldwide, at communities where there is sparse population, dispersed population, large geographic area, they all encounter transportation challenges. Resource industry in most of these continues to be the dominant. Increasingly, and this is a change, certainly in the OECD countries, aging populations, out-migration over many decades, and increasingly labor market shortages, highlighting the need for productivity and innovation to be absolutely essential in all sectors. And then the real focus of this presentation is, and it was a driving element of the North Atlantic Islands program, continues to be a unifying theme in the North Atlantic Forum, and always an element of the work of SURF and RPLC, is the role of governance at all levels. And what really was, I think, a key with a contribution of the North Atlantic Islands program and the books and conferences and knowledge mobilization that came out of that, was seeing governance as a resource for development. And the work of the North Atlantic Islands program, comparing places like Newfoundland and Labrador, PEI, provinces in a federation, and indeed in Canada, the provinces are quite strong. But if you look at sub-provincial level, the area that I've worked in most of my research career, comparing Newfoundland and Northern Norway, and more work in Iceland. Canada has the weakest local government of all the OECD countries. Newfoundland and Labrador, in fact, has the weakest local government in Canada. So while we have strong decentralization to the provincial level, sub-provincial with really big territories were really weak. And then you look at the Nordic countries in general, quite the opposite. They're unitary states, no equivalent of provinces or states, but as a result, I believe, very strong local government, and in most of the Nordic countries, based on the original church parish areas, most of my work in Norway, certainly the case. So you had local government today still, commune government, communa, with 5, 10, 15, 20, 40 communities, all within interactive proximity, but under one local government, and really significant capacity. In Norway, collect up to 14% of income tax. In fact, collect all income tax, keep up to 14%, send the rest to Oslo. So, you know, it's a dramatic difference in the way governance is exercised from what we take to be the norm in Canada. And that was the real power of the North Atlantic Islands program for many, and of comparative research in general. And then you could look at places like the Åland Islands. And I won't get ahead of myself, so I'll come back to some of the lessons from those places. When we look at and what the book Remote Control really emphasized, drawing on the presentations from the conference in Twillingate, but also with some invited chapters that built on the network in North Atlantic Forum and in SURF, is that globalization, we all hear the buzzwords, think global, act local. It absolutely does offer potential for rural individuals and groups and remote jurisdictions, but it doesn't guarantee it, obviously. You just need to look at the outcomes around the world. You have to have the tools to make the most of the resources that are at your disposal. And it's critical to understand how the local can be mobilized for maximum benefit. And so in the book, we talked about the lessons from the conference, the lessons from these various research networks, and what you need to do or what you can do. And it all needs to vary by jurisdiction. You can't take models from one place and drop them into another location, not taking into account context, history, culture. But there are definitely transferable lessons, generalizable lessons. And that's what this book really sought to derive on how governance in particular can inform development opportunities. And especially for those places that are small, largely rural, isolated by distance or natural barriers for islands such as oceans. And so some of the key questions that drove the authors of the book and the conclusions we synthesized, me and Godfrey and Larry, from the book: how can local capacity be developed? What are the most important agents of change for that? The players, structure and agency, all that good stuff. What role do local governments play, and governance in general, in maximizing governance as a resource for development? And indeed, how can isolation, smallness, and marginality in an increasingly global world, globally connected world, in fact be advantageous? And I think one of the key lessons, and my colleague Godfrey has emphasized for years, is that it's really key, and one of the key lessons, I think, it's easy to be romantic and want to be independent like Iceland, and they are an amazing model, and they hit hard when their economic crisis and the global financial crisis hit. But like many small jurisdictions, and I think disease and the spread of disease has often been used as an analogy, it often hits small jurisdictions and islands faster and harder, but it leaves faster. Whereas in a larger continental context, it hits, it gradually spreads, it starts to clear up, it comes back. And I think Iceland, and indeed the Republic of Ireland, a lot of people were writing them off after the decline, but they're doing very well now, thank you very much. And so I think there's some lessons from those, but I think some of the lessons, as I mentioned, Godfrey has highlighted over the years, is that it really helps to be a small jurisdiction, integrated, connected with a larger jurisdiction, but maximize your autonomy, your flexibility within that larger jurisdiction. And the same within larger trade networks, European Union. And so maybe romantic to want to be like Iceland. And if the context was right, situation right, maybe that's the way to go. But in almost all cases where small jurisdictions have had referenda over the last couple of decades, and they could have had a process to lead to autonomy, they've actually chosen to stay attached to the larger jurisdiction, but maximize their nimbleness, the resources within that. So in terms of the lessons around the North Atlantic Rim from this project, from the conference, and indeed from across Canada with the SURF project, some of the governance tools in the toolkit, some of the lessons from Iceland, 330,000 people. We often are told in Newfoundland and Labrador as a province, and PEI gets this as well, you're the equivalent of 3 subway stops in Toronto. Why the hell are you a province? Doesn't make any sense at all. Big cities are where all the action is. Listen to Richard Florida and the big city mayors. And I absolutely believe the big cities in Canada need more resources, need more capacity. In Canada, and I'll come to some slides later, the federal government has by far the most authority and resources. The provinces are quite strong. Beneath the provincial level, big cities, small cities, rural municipalities are all starved for capacity. So it shouldn't be big city versus small or versus rural municipal. It should be, how do we decentralize more in Canada? And what are the lessons from elsewhere? And what are the lessons they can derive from us? So for us, looking at Iceland, a seat at the UN, all the tools in their toolkit, and when they screw up, there's no one else to blame. And the Icelanders, they really did exercise democratic efficacy, the sense of controlling their own future, because they had no one else to look to. So when their downturn hit, they had mass mobilization and turfed a lot of the politicians and the clique that were feeding on each other, that led to the irrational exuberance that made them think they could do anything. And they've actually focused. They've had some tough years, but they're growing. And I think the Irish model is not too different from that. Isle of Man, really interesting place. Crown dependency of Britain in the Irish Sea, has much greater fiscal autonomy than a Canadian province, but with only 75,000 people. And they've been an offshore financial center, but what they found also is that as people move there to take advantage of the tax savings, a lot of these are wealthy people who have been successful in business. They get there, and like a lot of these people, well, they have the wealth, they have the capital, but they also have networks, they have knowledge, they have energy, they're creative, many of them, and they've actually invested in the Isle of Man. And in fact, one area that's really taken off is small-scale manufacturing, niche-based manufacturing. So some really amazing, and we did case studies as part of the North Atlantic Islands project. One company makes the thermostats in electric kettles based in the Isle of Man. And they go into a region of China and they research the water and the power, and then they go to a GE, General Electric, or a big company that makes the kettles and say, here's a thermostat and so that the kettle switches off when the water boils, tailored to that region. And so it's that kind of specialized, knowledge-based, high-tech, but not advancing new technology, applying new technology. And so real lessons like that I think small-scale manufacturing was one of the themes we looked at in the North Atlantic Islands program. I think a lot of the buzz around the new economy, and then when the resource economy, oil prices went way up, mining prices went way up, we quickly forget about the diversification opportunities. So I think a lot of the lessons of the North Atlantic Islands program that SURF has been sharing over several decades now are as pertinent and, in fact, more relevant today than ever. And maybe people will be willing to listen now that the resource boom, once again, is a bust. The Åland Islands, another fascinating place in the Baltic, small island. It's an archipelago, in fact, with just over 26,000 people. It's not even half a subway stop in Toronto. Well, through history and with the back and forth of the various wars, the people in the Åland speak Swedish, but they're part of Finland. And they are extremely entrepreneurial. For many years, they controlled a lot of the shipping within the Baltic. And when Finland became part of the EU, they got a special protocol just for the Åland Islands to protect their business in the Baltic. And what they mostly do now, it's export of knowledge-based services. They have companies that specialize in managing vessels worldwide in terms of the captains and the navigation. And so before the mill shut down in Grand Falls, Windsor in Newfoundland, the ship that went into Botwood to pick up the paper was managed by a company in the Åland Islands. So it's that kind of niche, knowledge-based, specialized entrepreneurial activity that is possible from the tiniest places that are able to use that niche to negotiate special arrangements in the biggest negotiated agreements like the EU in the world. And so it shows you the realm of the possible. The Economist, that bastion of conservative neoliberal thought, has had several articles over the years conflicting with the big is better. Big cities are where all the creativity is. Only large places can have the quality of life that people need. Incorrect. The UN Index of Well-Being, the Economist article from 2003, and there's been others since, that there are loads of jurisdictional examples of the highest quality of life in the world in small jurisdictions that maximize governance with economic capacity, with innovation, to forge a sustainable quality of life for their jurisdiction. Those are jurisdictions as opposed to sub-jurisdictional authorities like municipalities, regional development organizations, etc. But many of those lessons, I think, are generalizable, and I'll talk some more about that. So some of the winning tools and strategies that we learned from the conference, from the North Atlantic Forum, from the North Atlantic Islands Program, from SURF, and from the articles in the book. First of all, scaling up of municipal units. And I've presented on this, and there's been numerous conferences, and I think every province in Canada wrestles with this. Amalgamation or not amalgamation. And I personally am not a fan of amalgamation. Sancton, I think, Andrew Sancton is one of the people who've written on this a lot. I've worked with Robert Bish years ago on all this. And when you study forced amalgamations, they don't deliver the efficiencies or the economies. But and Bob Bish always used to say, councils are cheap, services are expensive, and we fight wars for democracy. So if people have a viable municipal democracy where there are competing seats and there's turnout for the election, why would we want to take away democracy? Well, what we have to make sure is that neighboring municipalities work together, especially where they're small, to maximize scale, maximize tools in their toolkit, the expert staffing, the economies of scale with available tax base, and indeed, SURF has had a lot of work over the last number of years on rural-urban interaction. And at Memorial University, Alvin Sims and David Freshwater and Jamie Ward have done a lot of work with the Harris Center, looking at functional economic regions and how the labor market areas, the catchment, our governance tools need to reflect the reality of how people live their lives. For very remote, isolated communities, that doesn't apply. And so we need special recognition and policy interventions for those places. But the vast majority of rural communities, the vast majority of rural people live within a locality, a catchment with 5, 10, 15 communities. And if they're not maximizing the benefits by scaling up at that level, they're pulling against gravity, and they can be proud and on their own and fail, or they can work together and maximize their opportunities. At the sectoral level, so a lot of my work, and I'll get less into it in this presentation, is on strategies by sector, around innovation, around clustering and all that good stuff. But this one is talking mainly about governance and structures, organizational structures, and the organizational tools that municipalities, regions, jurisdictions can develop. But some of the lessons from the book are on sector level stuff and how it interpenetrates with the structure stuff. And we have seen clearly in most rural areas, most remote jurisdictions see tourism as a great opportunity. It's largely seasonal. It's often low paid, unless you're the operator of the business, but even very profitable tourist operations are few and far between. But it does provide seasonal work, and it really complements quality of life in these regions. And it also really fits with branding and identity. So I think tourism is a strategic sector, not a massive contributor to GDP in the vast majority of locations, but a key strategic sector for a bunch of reasons. And commuter-driven industries. Very clearly, when you think about functional economic regions and the connection of localities, but also increasingly workforces that migrate to jobs outside the locality. Barb Neese at a Memorial has a big project called On the Move, looking at that across Canada and internationally. And there's been a lot of work done of late, pardon me, across Canada looking at the impact of the downward spiral of oil prices and all the people who are working in Fort McMurray, that downward drive on many resource sector activities and mining, and how that's impacting the commute workforce. So again, it provides an opportunity for rural and remote regions as the receptor and as the sender of workers, but we really need to understand the vulnerabilities of that for governance, for family, for health, for business success. A strategic engagement with their diaspora. And this is an area where there's some real good lessons from around the world. And I did make some notes for myself, make sure I don't forget some of these. I remember Patrice LeBlanc from Quebec doing a lot of work on the programs that used to be done in rural Quebec on keeping track of high school graduates in rural communities and seeing where they moved and keeping them informed on development activities in their region. And then I think they had some funding programs to bring them back the year before they graduated. And then internship opportunities where they match-made students with particular skills, trades, degrees, with employers in the region. It might be with a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant or a manufacturing firm or a fish operation. And I know the island of Vega in Norway, when I did my research way back when, for my PhD, had a similar type of program. And I think there's loads of examples. I think the Industrial Development Agency of Ireland has been very active using the Irish diaspora. Find a city in the world that doesn't have an Irish pub, and the sense of connection to Ireland in Newfoundland and Labrador. We have, it's the upside of the downside of having people leave for generations. Every conference, every workshop, practically every business. I was at a Hertz Rent-A-Car in Ottawa the other day. 2 of the 3 ladies were from Newfoundland. I returned the car late and I didn't get penalized. So we need to look at and map and track that diaspora really effectively. Universities do it with alumni. I think we should do a better job connecting that with our development efforts. And we have groups at, I know our incubator at Memorial, the Genesis Center, has advisory boards and mentors for the firms going through the incubation process. And they almost always find Newfoundlanders with major firms, sector leaders in Silicon Valley, in the US, in the UK, around the world, who are more than happy to share their networks, their knowledge, and often their capital. They wind up as investors in the firms. So I think that's a real opportunity, and that was talked about in the book. A branding of niche products and services. So first of all, I think there's massive opportunity, and I'll come to that in the next bullet on small-scale manufacturing, but even on services, on tourism opportunities, on lifestyle. People are gathering in big cities. The rural to urban migration is happening. It is happening often smaller communities adjacent to big cities, so that you have the best of both worlds. But most people still identify or want the benefits of rural, whether it be countryside, whether it be local food, whether it be what they grew up with or they've experienced when they were a tourist. The Shorefast Foundation on Fogo Island and Change Islands in Newfoundland has done an amazing job building a really cool high-end inn, but they've furnished it with traditional design influenced by new design, and they're manufacturing, for example, all the furniture. There's a lot of craft production with pillows and other things used in the inn that are now available on a website. And I think they're looking at an outlet, if they don't have it already, in Toronto. So people who come to Newfoundland, Labrador, come to Fogo Island, people with money, are willing to pay a premium to have products that are well built, well designed, but also bring meaning. And so there's opportunities in that. I mean, Champagne, for years, benefited from that in France. Local food, free range. There's all kinds of agricultural food products. Fishery is looking at it now in terms of the sustainable catch and branding around that. But it's knowledge-based, it's entrepreneurial, it's research-based, and it's not going to do itself. So it takes leadership. The book also talked about boutique small-scale manufacturing. David Freshwater has written on this stuff for years. It's not necessarily being high-tech, but using high-tech. I just talked to a lady yesterday based on the Burin Peninsula, south coast of Newfoundland, with dynamic air shelters. And there was a bunch of Newfoundlanders working for a company, I think it was in Edmonton. They were their best workers. So they moved the manufacturing to the Burin Peninsula. And then the company moved to the Burin Peninsula. They have staff in Houston. They just hired someone out of Nassau with expertise in materials. But they're exporting worldwide from a facility on the Burin Peninsula because the workers have a superb attitude. They're not going to be stolen by a neighboring firm. They want to work in that location, and they're well-paid year-round jobs. And there's loads of examples I know of across Canada and from the case studies we did in the North Atlantic Islands project. And yet, repeatedly, we ignore manufacturing, identifying it as old economy and thinking it has to be large-scale. We can't handle large-scale for the most part with our declining workforces unless they're highly automated. But small-scale has loads of opportunities, and it can be linked in with the niche products and services, branding, and so on. A limitation on local firm rivalry really comes back to all the stuff that's been written about over the last 25 years or more and beyond. If you read Alfred Weber, who was saying all this before the Michael Porter and others latched onto it. Connections between firms, agglomeration forces, are what economic geographers have talked about for years. And it's essential for companies. We have this myth about the lone wolf, individualistic entrepreneur. And absolutely, entrepreneurs have to be risk-taking. But if they don't know how to collaborate within their supply chain, with their customers, with their workers, they're not going to succeed. And so it's maybe an opportunity for remote rural regions which have a history of having to work together when it mattered to survive. Maybe we can harness that and develop the innovation, the risk-taking, while retaining the mutual commitment to region. And way back when, the work on the industrial districts in Italy, Emilia-Romagna, was largely driven by the commitment and sense of place to succeed against the first Italy, Turin and Milan, where the big manufacturing was, and the South, seen as more bureaucratic, and they were more remote from it. So I think we need to constantly be looking at how we broker, facilitate, catalyze those networks, those clusters for export. If you're not bringing new money into the region, you don't have an economy. So competing amongst yourselves is totally self-destructive. And I'm down to 10 minutes, so I'll move quickly if we want to finish within 40. The main theme of this presentation, it cuts across all these sector and strategic issues, is the creative deployment of the resourcefulness of jurisdiction. So I'll have a few more slides on that, and hopefully we'll have some good discussion. So most of us have heard the term subsidiarity developed by the Jesuits and how you deal with Rome. The European Union adopted it as a key element of their approach to dealing with supranational to national to regional to local. Some can debate how much it's actually applied, but there's a lot of programming. And in fact, I was talking to someone from Finland the other night in Ottawa who said that there's strong local governance capacity that's been enhanced in Finland to take advantage of the funds from the European Union. And so you can incent this stuff. Our governments in Canada, unfortunately, I would say especially the provincial governments, often get in the way of it because they're close enough to the action, the politicians and the bureaucrats, and they're well-meaning. They want to help. But if you don't build capacity at the sub-provincial level, where the action is with clusters and trade schools and universities connecting with firms and workforces and local municipalities, you're hurting yourself. So the concept of subsidiarity, starting at the local level and doing whatever makes sense there, then going to the regional, only going up to the national level for functions that make sense at that level. It's the exact opposite of how the Canadian Confederation was defined. But I'm hopeful, eternal optimist, with the changes in government in Newfoundland, Labrador, and in Ottawa, maybe there's a receptivity for it, and they say it is, for evidence-informed decision-making. All the evidence from the OECD, from the North Atlantic Islands Program, from SURF, really clear. We have to use governance at the local and regional level in concert with provincial and national, but we need a dramatic increase of capacity at the local level. So municipalities, regions, small jurisdictions have more room to maneuver also than they normally realize. So I've beaten up on our constitutional authority, but the reality is for local leaders who are willing to be innovative, they can do way more than they currently do with the powers they have. I did work way back when in Pasadena, Newfoundland, where Bill Party was a leader in working with the municipal powers he had, setting up the Venture Center, setting up entrepreneurial awareness programs, getting funding from the federal government at a time when, under the municipal legislation of the province, municipalities are a creature of the province in Canada, in the Constitution, it was against the law for municipalities to be involved in economic development. And over time, with the Task Force on Community Development and the work of municipalities Newfoundland and Labrador, the law was changed. But Bill Party, Sean Power in Buckens, and many other examples knew they had to be active and didn't let themselves, they were not hurting people. They were not taking undue risk. And so it's always that calculation of, we can't go too far in breaking the constitutional formal laws, but we can certainly push the boundaries. And there's loads of examples of that. In Norway, the government deliberately fostered, under what was called at the time the free commune experiment, neighboring municipalities or individual communes to take over federal powers, national powers, not federal. So the fisheries staff and the agricultural staff of the national government in the island of Vega, under the free commune experiment, reported to the municipality. They still had to uphold laws of the government, but on their proactive, creative, strategic direction, it came from the commune. What a concept. I think Danny Williams and Brian Peckford in Newfoundland. At the provincial level, Brian Peckford, when oil was discovered and the federal government had jurisdiction, and the province said we should have the oil offshore treated the same as is treated onshore in Alberta, and Peckford brought in the Newfoundland Labrador regulations, even though the feds contested it. And the oil company said, tell this joker to back off or we're going to pull out. And they did pull out. My dad's company went broke. But 6 months later, they came back on Newfoundland's terms. And before you knew it, the Atlantic Accord was developed by Brian Peckford and his team. And it took years for it to be fully implemented. Newfoundland just had an unprecedented decade of wealth. We didn't do a great job managing it, but hopefully we'll do our best. As I say in Alberta, there's bumper stickers that say, please God, let us have one more boom, and we promise not to waste the money. But that again comes back to jurisdiction and making the most of it. I think Aboriginal self-government is a fantastic example we all can be learning in all sectors, in Canada certainly, and probably internationally. Nunatsiavut in Labrador, really progressive, really innovative, partnering with researchers, an MOU with Memorial University, maximizing the room to maneuver. That's the key message there. So stretch their jurisdictional authority to advance their development goals, creative ways that are outside their formal allocation of powers. I heard about an example in Norway recently where municipalities have had no role, to my knowledge, in fisheries management, and yet it's so essential to the success of rural coastal fishing communities. So what they did is didn't pretend to have authority over fish stocks or quotas or landings, but they got involved with multiple stakeholders on coastal planning. And coastal planning, of course, has to involve the fish sector. So you've changed the frame of reference creatively. And that opens up new ways of thinking. And I think there's endless ways of doing that. But in the end, it does come down to leadership who are willing to partner and forge new systems. And I'll never forget a meeting I had with a Faroese and a Greenlandic partners in the North Atlantic Islands program, and we were talking about the Icelanders. And I asked them, what is it about the Icelanders? Why are they able to do as much that they do? And they both said, you know what it is? They dare. They don't ask for permission. They dare to do things, try things. Sometimes it doesn't work, but often it does. And that's the only way you innovate, using governance to advance development at any level. And I have some other examples that I could talk about in terms of new systems, cross-municipal. I think the Columbia Basin example is a great one in Canada. There are municipal joint councils that are not under the law, but just getting together and doing things in our province. There are lots of examples of development corporations, a bigger city, but Tech Edmonton is a partnership between the University of Alberta and the city of Edmonton. We could be doing lots more like that. There's a lot of work in the US these days on anchor institutions and how universities and hospitals should be connecting more with municipal development, innovation, clusters. In Newfoundland and Labrador, Grand Falls Windsor has identified healthcare and working with the university as a key opportunity for research and providing service to people in the region, et cetera, et cetera. A couple of slides I've used forever. They're not in the book, I don't think, but I can't help but use them very quickly. This one, Denzel Doyle developed years ago. Sorry, I usually put his name on the slide. And for Canada, under our Constitution, this is what it looks like. The vast majority of the power, fiscal, legislative, is at the national level. A whole lot is at the provincial. The triangle, sub-provincial, should be a wispy little line, in fact. And yet, political will to save your community is greatest in your community. It's also a lot in your region, in your locality. So if you're in Millertown, where my wife is from, in the middle of Newfoundland, you wish your kids could get a job in Millertown. But if it's in Buckens, 20 minutes away, that's not so bad. If it's in Grand Falls, Windsor, 45 minutes away, we can live with that. At the provincial level, politicians, public servants have to work for the whole province. Federal, even bigger jurisdiction. And so where the will is greatest to use the powers at your disposal, in our system, the capacity is the least. And venture capitalists know, if you want a business to succeed, you want the person who's running the business to have their mortgage on the line. So that they stay awake at night to make that business succeed. Well, where the people stay up awake at night wanting their community to succeed in Canada, they have the least capacity to act on it. And then I adapted it in terms of specialized knowledge, local knowledge. Still a critical role for the federal government. International trade, it would be loony for regions or provinces in Canada to have a trade commissioner in Europe. We need to do a better job connecting the specialized knowledge of them with the community priorities, opportunities, strengths. And we haven't done a good job of that in the past. And yet, if you focus on clusters, innovation regions, it's there where the action is, and you actually ultimately develop specialized knowledge in the sector you're good at the local level, access with the right knowledge elsewhere. Very quickly, and this is going back to my PhD thesis way back when, this is a checklist I developed, and I've used it throughout my career, on understanding what are the strengths and weaknesses of your organization, of your regional authority, of your province. And they need to be geared to fit the mandate and strategy you're trying to implement. So where does the money come from? Do you have taxpayers, tax powers? He who pays the piper calls the tune. So if you're getting money from federal government or provincial government, they're going to want to have criteria. You have to be very explicit and intentional in understanding what's within your powers, how can you push them, how can you expand them. Human resources, leadership, skilled staff, community participation, I can talk more about these. Legal authority, I think we often downplay in community development. It's absolutely essential, and that's why I think the Nordic model has a lot of lessons for us. And it's why democratic accountability, legitimacy, empowers municipal leaders or regionally elected leaders to represent the community in ways that non-governmental NGO leaders, which are absolutely essential, but they need to be partnering with the ones who have that formal political accountability. I've worked in the Premier's office. I know it makes a difference. And then geographic area. Our individual municipalities, dots on the map, unless they're rural, remote, aren't adequate to advance economic development. It has to be a regional approach. I think I'm almost done. So, we need to be assertive and creative. Good governance is the key to long-term sustainability. Communities, regions, and provinces can position and lobby for more powers, but they also can make much better use of the powers they have. And one in my concluding chapter in the book talks about, it's really simple, I think. I don't know why you need to even say it, but I've seen in Saskatchewan, in Newfoundland, Labrador, so much policy development without taking these things into account. Whatever the policy, whatever the initiative, whatever the sector, how do we govern in this policy area? How can we devolve authority if we're a larger jurisdiction? Or how can we use what we have, no matter what size you are? And how can you partner outside your jurisdiction or with other sectors? And I think that has to be an explicit part of every rural, regional, small jurisdiction, island development plan. So that's my spiel. Hopefully I'm relatively on time. And hopefully everybody doesn't agree with what I've said. And I'd love to have some conversation.
Okay, thank you so much, Rob. I know I personally found that very interesting, and there's a lot of lessons there that I think are very applicable to the Nova Scotian context, which has some similar things to Newfoundland, of course. So we're going to open it up to questions. If you do have a question, just put it in the chat box. So that button for the chat box should be at the bottom of your screen. So if you put your mouse down to the bottom of the screen, that will come up, and you can just type to everyone or to me specifically. So I guess I'll start off with a question just in terms of the Canadian context. If we do want municipalities to have that kind of nimbleness and the jurisdictional authority to make the changes and take the opportunities that they have, who needs to lead that change? Is it the federal government? Is it a constitutional change, or do the municipalities just need to start daring, I guess?
And am I on if I talk? Okay. I think it's multifaceted. Paul Martin, when he was Prime Minister, on the cities and communities agenda with the gas tax allocation for municipalities, was one mechanism by the national government to try to support this province across the provinces. The Harper government was much more respectful, some would say, of provincial jurisdiction, largely others would say as a way to minimize federal activity, consistent with the Harper neoliberal small government mantra. That opened an opportunity, I thought, for provinces to be more proactive, but ironically, almost without any alignment with ideology or political party across the country. We've seen over the last decade, province after province, with an attack on local governance capacity in terms of regional rural development authorities, but also the ability of municipalities, I think. but I'd love to hear contrary views from our colleagues online. So I think the federal government can play a role through mechanisms like that, but the real power to implement change, and forget a constitutional change, that'll never happen with all the ins and outs of that in this country, but provinces totally have the power to implement innovative solutions for municipal economic development, capacity, regional cooperation, and some have. I think the regional district model in British Columbia, which Bob Bish helped develop, is a great model, very flexible. I think the MRC, Municipal Regional Counties in Quebec, which actually I seem to believe, and others can update me, have survived the draconian cuts and restructuring that have happened lately in Quebec. A lot of the other structures haven't survived. And so they allowed a mechanism for neighboring municipalities to come together, but it was facilitated by the province. But again, as I mentioned in the presentation, I think any municipality, any cluster of municipalities and NGOs can come together, develop a plan, utilize the resources at their disposal. Ryan Gibson with SURF has done really good work lately, looking at opportunities for community foundations to tap into resources for various sector strategies or economic initiatives, community capacity. So there's a load to work on from all levels. I just think we need to be more deliberate and see structures and governance, the power it has for development, instead of just focusing on ad hoc, piecemeal, individual projects. Open to other, so should I just respond to these questions online, or?
I don't know if Maggie wants to moderate any of it, or if you want to grab any that you see here.
Maggie, will I just respond as we go? So I'll start at the top with my good colleague and Mint. Oh no, he's not at the top. Sorry, David. Kathleen, to everyone, the responsibility is shared. How do we ensure all actors are engaged in this local level? And largely it's reach out. And we do have a lot of municipalities that are the biggest part of the problem. They have old guard mayors, councils, staff who think they're the only game in town, and that clearly inhibits development. And so then we often see a lot of innovative, community-based, outside of local government. And in my view, that's great and creative, but government is too important to allow to remain isolated from that creativity and innovation. So I think it's getting the players together in various innovative ways and exercise democracy. It may mean voting out the old crowd. And that involves getting in the trenches and getting active in an election. I guess that there's no way for back and forth dialogue, so I'll just keep rattling through these unless someone interrupts me. David Douglas asks, what do we mean by governance? Well, there's a great book by David Douglas with chapters by us on rural planning and development, I think it is. And there's loads written on governance. So what I mean by governance is organizations, either formal levels of the state, like municipal government, which I very explicitly include as a state organization, because it has, in areas of its jurisdiction, ultimate recourse to the legitimate use of force. And I think that matters in development, in bringing in laws, taxes, regulations, and if you don't work with that, you're pulling against gravity. But by the same token, you need to harness non-governmental organizations, sector organizations, industry associations who get involved also. And absolutely a much abused term, and I'm happy to abuse it further. But I think anybody listening should know what I'm talking about. Kathy Goulet. Hi, Ray Bowman said hi, Rob, so hi, Ray. One of the best resources in Canada for rural development for many years with his work in StatsCan. Kathy Goulet, to everyone, I am in rural Alberta, work with a number of regional economic groups. Thoughts on regional definition, spatial common interests? Great question. And I think it does depend on the activity you're talking about. And it is why I like, in fact, the BC regional district model, because what makes sense for tourism planning, which can be a very large region, and really helped influence the economic zones in Newfoundland. We had 20 of them, but also where were the airports, where were the major centers that fed into those rural catchment areas. If you're talking economic development and employment, I really do believe that labor market areas, localities, the work on functional economic regions that Alvin Sims, Dave Freshwater are doing, really are where the action is. And that's where employers care most about it. But again, depending on, form should follow function. The trade-off is if you have too many governance bodies, it makes accountability too messy. And that's one of the complaints with the regional district model. The Quebec approach was the MRCs, where the government drew lines around 10, 15, 20 communities, said if you don't like these, come up with better. But if you don't, you're going to live with these. And the only role you had to perform at that level was regional planning. But if you then want to perform other functions collectively, you can use this as a tool. Diane Looker, is it not the case that communities with good governance and human and other resources are more likely to develop further capacity, while those with less capacity are less likely to have the resources to develop capacity? How do we get around this? A really fundamental point, Diane. And in development, there always has been and there always will be winners and losers. And if a community is self-destructing, feeding on itself, full of boss hog leaders who want to control things or are downright corrupt, and the people don't rise up and address it through democratic means, in a democracy, it's trite and mean, maybe. I'll really get on the nerves of some people. In a democracy, people get the government they deserve, if the democracy is functioning at all. That said, for communities and regions that are traditionally really weak capacity, it doesn't mean we give up on them. I think we need effective means to partner with small communities. Universities, I think, have an obligation, colleges too. But ultimately, and there's a lot of literature from African development, animateurs going in with World Bank support, making lots of good stuff happen, and the day they leave, it dies. That's not development. So we need to build the capacity and the formal governance tools so they take ownership. I think that's pretty obvious, but hopefully that answers your question. Someone else in rural Alberta with terrible typing, I didn't catch the name of the person working on community foundations, is Ryan Gibson, who is on the SURF board. Who's president now? Oh, okay. Al is president, but Ryan is on the SURF board, and he's based at St. Mary's in Halifax. And he's in St. John's. We're actually have a meeting after this today. So Ryan is a fantastic guy to connect with on the community foundation work. And of course, there are community foundations across Canada. And the Harris Centre has a partnership with the Community Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador, producing the Vital Signs document, which is a wonderful tool that helps build capacity, identify issues, etc. Here's one from the REMO HP in Nova Scotia. The province of Nova Scotia is presently doing a review of Municipal Government Act. Any ideas of resources to guide possible changes? Well, read remote control. Read the report from every SURF conference over the last 30 years. Look at some of the reports from the OECD on local governance and economic development. And there's a bunch of us in the SURF and North Atlantic Forum Network that you could pull together. I remember when the Rural Secretariat existed in Ottawa, shut down under the Harper government, they did a Delphi process where they pulled together a bunch of people who didn't know who each other were initially to feed in ideas, and then brought us all together. And so, evidence-informed decision-making, knowledge mobilization, there's loads of best practices. Just don't do it sitting at your desk in the public service, on the web, without actually engaging human beings outside the university. In municipalities, Newfoundland and Labrador actually has a superb website and resources on this stuff as well. Ray again, would you recommend that the new federal government develop a rural policy, or should a rural policy come from provinces? I think the federal government, and they seem to be willing to do this after 10 years of not doing any of this kind of thing, needs a federal provincial process to look at regional development, Ray. I think rural all too often in Ottawa equates with agriculture. Agriculture is absolutely essential industry, and increasingly so in Newfoundland as elsewhere. But I think we need rural and remote communities to get over themselves and start seeing how they link with urban. I mentioned in my presentation I was going to talk about it. I was just in Ottawa for a week, and the Labrador Chamber of Commerce and the Baffinland Chamber of Commerce in Nunavut have done 3 or 4 of these now, where they go to Ottawa and hold a conference called Northern Lights, and they had 1,100 delegates, and they organize the conference, and they book out the Shaw Center, the whole thing, and they have Aboriginal and Northern crafts and art and music. They have presentations, and all the senior business leaders, the Prime Minister came through. That, to me, is an example of how federal and provincial and local can be bold, but you got to get in their face. So I think it'd be a mistake to ask the federal government to try to do it on their own, and I don't think it should be explicitly rural. It should be rural, regional, and what are the urban-rural linkages. Maybe we need new language. Joanna Ashworth, I am interested in capacity development of participatory governments. What would you say are the key skills, knowledge, to have a healthy, functioning governing body? Well, there's a lot of, well, I've mentioned some of this already. There are people who specialize in good governance. I'll screw up the name. The group in Ontario, Harold Fleming used to be involved with TORC, the Ontario Rural Council, and there was a leadership group. So one of you can feed that in who knows the name, unless Boyan can come up with it here in the room. And they focused on leadership in particular, and a lot of work in the US is on leadership for rural and regional development. I think there's a lot of overlap with good governance in general. So there's the governance in regions with inter-organization governance, but there's also board governance. And I have seen throughout my career in government, in NGOs, in the university, terrible governance repeatedly. And so I think there are lots of toolkits for good board governance, good management, good priority setting, good decision making. Several years ago, Dave Curran, who passed away a few years ago, David Douglas and I ran a workshop at the Gardner Center at Memorial University on moving strategy to action, and the governance tools and decision-making tools, and the provincial government here picked up on it, on the stage gate decision-making kind of process, opportunity development framework tools, project management. I think a lot of this stuff is not magic, and the tools are at our fingertips. We just need political leaders at all levels and staff in NGOs and in municipalities who speak truth to power and use the tools that we have. David Douglas says, just done a review of international practice. Most of local government restructuring has been an exercise in public administration, not rural or regional development. How do we integrate these initiatives? And I think, David, that may go back to what Ray raised about having that explicit dialogue about rural, regional development through good governance and link the two. Ryan Gibson, God bless you. His email address is Ryan with a capital R, .Gibson with a capital G at smu.ca. Are other people able to see these comments? I don't need...
The one sent to everyone, yeah, I skipped this one here. This one would only be seen by us.
Okay, James Gordon to me privately. So what does that mean?
I think you just sent it to your name in the list, but I think it's the answer.
Okay. Given that comment on true development capacity, do you think there is a tipping point in rural decline beyond which it is next to impossible to turn it around? The work Alvin Sims and David Freshwater have done, and my colleague Boyan will punch me out now any moment, because I personally am a qualitative researcher. I believe leadership, capacity, identity, social cohesion are absolutely essential to development. But I also believe, there's some quantitative, numerical evidence that's hard to ignore. So I think we need to take the quantitative, put it through good qualitative processes, and make good decisions. But what Alvin and Dave have done, have developed tools using the RAN lab, we call it the Regional Analytics Lab at Memorial, using the data that we have for all of Atlantic Canada, and classified in Atlantic Canada 5 categories. Large municipal, essentially Halifax and St. John's regions, not the municipalities. Small, diversified urban, and then rural 1, rural 2, and rural 3. And really interesting when you look at the quantitative measures of productivity across those categories, some of the rural 3 actually have the highest productivity. So this crap from Richard Florida and company, that only large urban with bohemian idea people drinking lattes is the route to innovation. I think there's something to be said about crossing sectoral boundaries and sharing ideas, and that's what learning regions are about. But there are loads of examples across Canada, and the data in Atlantic Canada is really clear, of the worst case small, remote, rural having a mine, having a very productive, efficient, well-run fish plant, having a wood manufacturing operation, and they are not basket cases, thank you very much. But it's really narrow dependence on a single firm or a few firms in a particular sector. I'm not a fatalist. I don't think any place is beyond saving. I know governments aren't good at picking winners. I also think they're not good at picking losers. But I do believe if we're going to address this point you raised about tipping points, we need ruthless honesty, good quantitative data, good leadership, good staff, and there are many places that are about managing decline. And I think we need good policy for palliative care communities. One lady on the Bonavista Peninsula, a leader in a workshop, talked about how she lives in a sea of widows because men die earlier, families have moved away, and these ladies living in their homes are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I don't see how you turn that around without an influx of new humans. And so we need to manage that appropriately. And governance tools are key for that. Point here, if anyone would like to use a microphone, just ask at Central, and they will unmute you, because you're probably getting sick of my voice. I am. I have some agreement that we shouldn't equate rural with agriculture, and that's very true with Alberta. And it was true in, having the rural secretariat in the Department of Agriculture in Ottawa was just wrong. So let's try to get over that. Angelique to everyone. I was at a watershed conference where it was suggested by First Nations participants that in their system, the most local residents had the most control and the furthest visitor had the least power. It was suggested that with one respect to our most precious resource, water, we ought to recreate our boundaries around watersheds. I love this idea. And I think I'm not an expert on water, although the Harris Center has funding from RBC Blue Water Campaign. And Boyan can let people, well, you go to our website. There's been a bunch of research around that. The only caution I'd raise there, I think there's some real interesting cases. Bill Reimer often cites the one from New York City, I think it is, where their water supply comes from the towns in the Catskills in the mountains. And they've developed an agreement and transfer resources to the municipalities in the Catskills to be good stewards of the water New York depends on. So I think there's a way we can monetize that and make the most of it. But I also think sometimes on environmental issues, and I would like to think the Aboriginal leaders that you were citing are good examples of this. The people who live there have the highest stakes in protecting it, and so therefore they will. But there are also examples of cultures and people, and Newfoundland historically often had a slash and burn culture. You go in any dirt road and there's pop-up garbage dumps. Not quite as sexy as pop-up delis. And so you need higher levels of authority to impose good governance in those cases. So I think there are key lessons that have to be adapted depending on the culture, the powers, and the issue you're talking about. Torque, I wouldn't want air traffic control managed at the municipal level, etc. Mark Cassidy highlighted, I'm talking about the Rural Ontario Institute. Thank you for that. And I know they've done a lot of work on leadership. Okay, Elaine, follow up on Angelique's comment. That's how water management works in Bali, because most of the rice fields are built on terraces there. The man at the bottom of the terrace is the man to manage the resources because he wants the resource to reach him, and in reaching him, it will have reached everyone else. Although in a sense, that's counter in principle, I think, to what was said, because he's actually in that particular water system, the one most remote from presumably the source of the water. But I may be just being argumentative there. But for me, the point there is form should follow function. What are we trying to achieve? What's the nature of this? Is it tourism? Is it port infrastructure? Is it labor force development? Is it water management? And then what's the right size area and the right tools to manage around that? One size does not fit all. Generalizable lesson. Have I worn you all out? Maggie's saying thank you. So I don't know how we are for time. I'm not going anywhere, but if anyone has any further questions or comments, happy to address them. Read the books. Go on the Harris Center website. Come to the Surf Conference in Guelph. Come to the North Atlantic Forum Conference in Bo, Norway. And we'll keep learning from each other.
Oh, I'm here.
Hi.
Hi. I've been muted, which is why I haven't been helping out with the questions, but thank you, Rob, for fielding all of those. Some really great answers. And I do want to thank you on behalf of the RPLC for this really fascinating discussion and presentation. And I will note to everyone that there will be an evaluation survey sent out, as well as probably some of the links and contact information that we shared today.
Okay, thanks a million, and everybody have a great day.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone else who tuned in this afternoon.
And thanks to John Duff for making this happen, and RPLC. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh.